Richard, welcome back to the Health Path podcast. It's been, probably 3 years or so since we last spoke. So, how have you been?
Hi, Alex. Yeah, I've been very well, thanks. Yeah, I've been traveling around a fair bit. I'm no longer based in London. I'm now in the Bay Area in California, studying a PhD in psychology and working on getting breathwork, more credentials, promoting breathwork and non-ordinary states of consciousness for healing. And yeah, as I've mentioned, I spent a bit of time in Peru, learning a little bit about ayahuasca and how that non-ordinary state of consciousness can be really amazing for all sorts of mental health conditions.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's such an exciting area to kind of dive into. I'm looking forward to picking your brain on it, I guess. With your experiences in Peru, it reminds me of Heroic Hearts UK, sort of a charity that are taking war vets into the Amazon for sort of ayahuasca ceremonies based on sort of, I guess, some of the evidence there of its potential benefit in treating people with PTSD. And they're seeing some amazing experiences and stories from some of these war vets. So I guess a question that comes to mind, and especially for those that might not have listened to our first conversation, what kind of got you into this area? What got you wanting to do sort of that for your PhD, for example?
Yeah, so I had my own mental health challenges from a very young age, depression, anxiety, insomnia, addiction, and regular mental health trainings, standard talk therapy. Whilst, I loved my first therapist and he was really an amazing person, I didn't really heal until I found these non-ordinary states of consciousness, such as conscious connected breath work and ayahuasca. And yeah, so when I got into breath work, the first session I did with Alan Dolan, aka the Breath Guru, who I'm still affiliated with now, a lot of like treatments, whether it's Reiki, which I'm also certified in, or acupuncture, you think, oh yeah, that's probably working. I think something's happening there. I feel a little bit better. It's probably to do with the Reiki. And then when I did this breathwork session with Alan, I went into just a complete other dimension, and I came back and I was just like, oh my God, what happened? Where have I been? This is incredible. I immediately signed up my wife for a session the next day, and she's still a breath worker working with Alan to this day. And so, yeah, it was just that wow factor of just like, oh my God, you can just do this at home with an experienced guide, and you can go to the most unbelievable places. And yeah, that kind of kickstarted my journey onto mental health with these non-ordinary states of consciousness. I then started I'd already been doing meditation, but breathwork was like, the Daily Mail have called it meditation on steroids because it feels like it's doing something more. And then combining that with things like float tanks and then psilocybin mushrooms and then ayahuasca. And I kind of feel like that's, if you're interested in that kind of journey, that's the kind of progression. Maybe you start with a bit of breathwork, then you go into a float tank, and then you do some psilocybin, and then ayahuasca is probably at the top of that pyramid. I'm sure a lot of people would debate and maybe put iboga there or ketamine in there somewhere, but yeah, that's my way of thinking. It would be a good first intro for most people. And yeah, I did toy with the idea of getting more involved with ayahuasca. And as I mentioned, I've been to Peru, but the reason I focus on breathwork, and I call myself the breath geek, and I'm studying a PhD in breathwork, is because it's so much more accessible. Breathwork is legal, whereas ayahuasca, while legal in places like Costa Rica and Peru, is not legal in most of the other parts of the world. And I wanted to get people healing as quickly as possible. And I work for a charity called Duty to Care, who provide mental health services for the NHS staff in the UK. And NHS staff, come from the medical paradigm. And, a lot of the time when people call me interested, they say, oh, well, where's the research on breathwork? And I'm just like, sorry, there isn't any, but I'm working on it. And yeah, that was kind of my experience of like, wow, there's no research on this. Someone had better go do it. And so yeah, that's where I'm at, thinking, trying to do that for the breathwork community.
Brilliant. And I just feel like clarifying that, and this is very much tongue in cheek, but we're not recommending doing meditation and then psilocybin and a float tank on the same day. They're kind of
Yeah,
separate things.
yeah,
So, I mean, that's great. The fact that you saw there was this missing piece to the puzzle, which is obviously the research. We have anecdotal evidence going back, obviously, to probably, I think, like 60s and 70s when things like holotropic breath work and the rebirthing method were born, so to speak. So where are you at with your PhD, and I guess what are you doing within that research, and what's going to be coming into the world as a result of that work?
Yes, well, it's a good question, because I'm sort of tied between two types of studies. So there is a fair bit of research, like people trying to put together theoretical frameworks of being like, well, maybe it works because of polyvagal theory, or it works because you're getting help from guides or ancestors, or maybe it's just down regulating the nervous system. But there isn't really a solid understanding of what works. So the question is, do I try and prove how it works or that it works? So there's various randomized control trials, but there isn't really anything on those the conscious connected breathworks, which are holotropic, clarity breathwork, transformational, rebirthing, all those things. There is quite a lot more research on like yogic breathwork, but whilst yoga breathwork's amazing, I think that for mental health treatments, they don't put you in the same non-ordinary states of consciousness that the conscious connected ones do. So, gold standard of research is a randomized control trial. So I'm thinking of doing a randomized control trial with some participants who have moderate to mild anxiety and depression, taking them through an 8-week course of one-to-one or group breath work with me, and then measuring their outcomes at the end of that session, or that 8-week period. The problem is, how do you blind people who are doing this? So in mental health, some of the time they'll just say the blind is treatment as usual. So whatever a person is doing, they'll just continue doing it. They'll measure using something like the Beck Depression Inventory at the start of their 8 weeks and at the end, and see if anything's changed. Because this is a big problem with a lot of treatments, is regression to the mean. So a lot of the time with depression, it just goes away on its own, thankfully. I think something like 60% of depression goes away within 2 months, and like 80% goes away within 2 years. So it's a bit like if you got a cold, and I said, oh, Alex, do you know what's going to help your cold? Breath work. And then you did breath work and your cold went away. Your cold went away not because of the breath work, but because you got over the cold. But if I did a trial at the same time, that could suggest that breath work helped you, but it didn't really, because it may do, but it's likely that you just beat it on your own. So that's the real challenge with mental health studies, is proving that the breath work is actually doing something special, rather than just being a placebo or your own personal immune system or life changes coming into play. So how does one blind? The other thing I might do is having some participants in the blind group just doing nasal breathing, just lying there on their own for 8 weeks, having that like hour, 90-minute session to just be still. And then that would kind of prove, okay, is it just the stillness that's healing people, or is there something about this conscious connected breath work that is doing something above and beyond just stillness, that's taking people to places that they can't go without that breath work? But my fear there is, like, most people are so stressed and so busy in their life, just 90 minutes of just being supported lying down is probably going to be really healing for people as well. So I don't know if that's going to be sort of good enough to prove what I want to prove, or to discover what I want to discover. The other option is, I could just give people a sugar pill and just say, here, have this antidepressant, this new antidepressant. You're in this group, and the other people are going to do breath work, and then compare a placebo that way. There are, of course, a lot of ethical considerations to these types of things. And when you're doing a PhD, you do have to go to an ethics committee. So yeah, those are the kind of, that's the first way study I'm thinking of doing. The other one is looking at using the Muse Headband. You can actually get the Muse Headband, and there's a special app where you can record people's brain waves. And then a lot like Joe Dispenza does, he records people in the states of his meditations, and you know, he correlates a lot of gamma brain waves with mystical experiences. So I'd like to see, if I take someone into this non-ordinary state of consciousness through the breath work, what brain waves are happening. Is the, you know, the high anxious ones, you know, like high beta, is that going down? Are people going just down into alpha, which you can get into in meditation, or are they going somewhere like theta, which supposedly is where trauma resolution happens, and gamma, which supposedly is where mystical experiences happen? And is that actually relevant as well? Is it actually doing something, being like, oh yeah, I did breath work and I put someone into gamma brainwaves? Like, great, but is their life any better? You know, have I recovered from depression? Am I feeling happier? Do I sleep better? So I need to do more research into brainwaves myself. And if any listeners have any advice or guidance for me, yeah, please reach out. I'm all ears.
That's amazing. I mean, that's fascinating, all of it. So I was just thinking that though, Richard, around, you know, 90 minutes of lying on my back on the floor would just be heaven right now.
Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, there are multiple challenges there. And I guess something going back to what you said earlier around like guardians and spirits. I mean, I've certainly had a handful of experiences in breath work where I feel I have come into contact with what I describe as essentially kind of guardian spirits and or potentially ancestors. So a phrase that came to mind that I sort of learned from synthesis is, you know, the many ways of knowing. And I guess there's that kind of cultural side of understanding, well, what is going on in these kind of non-ordinary states of consciousness and how do we interpret that? But I love that you kind of brought up, you know, these different perspectives of what's going on.
Yeah, I think with yeah, one of the things my mentor says is like, you know, we have sort of different influences in our life. We have, you know, our brain, which in our society is preferred, and we have, you know, our emotions, then we have our bodies, and then we have our sort of our spiritual side. And what we're doing in breath work is demoting the brain from the CEO to a department head, so that other voices can come in and offer guidance. And you know, I think a lot of the time certainly with anxiety, is because we're too much in our heads, and it's because we're overthinking things and we can't quieten our minds. And yeah, I think, I can't remember who said it, but it's like you can't rationalize your way out of a problem that you rationalize yourself into, and hence you need other voices, you know, your emotions, your spirits, your body, and things like that. Not to say that the brain doesn't have a really important role, it's just, yeah, it needs to be more of a democracy.
Yeah. And I guess one of the things that comes up is obviously there's been a lot of publicity around Dr. Carhart Harris's research with the default mode network and psilocybin. And I'm wondering, you know, do you have any thoughts on whether that could be sort of a very similar mechanism with breath work as well?
Yeah, absolutely. That is one of the theoretical frameworks I'm toying with, is like, yeah, what happens? I think I did see some research. I could be wrong here, but I think I did see that, yes, breathwork does downregulate that default mode network, so that you can, just like in psilocybin, you know, relax, think a bit more clearly, get into that sort of safe state that you supposedly do with MDMA. You know, you feel very safe, so you can go back to the memories if it's a PTSD, or if it's, you know, a complex PTSD, you know, smaller memories, smaller traumas, and you can reprocess them in that sort of safe environment, and sort of complete that process of trauma, the, you know, excitation of survival energy, and sort of relinquishing that survival energy, so that you can go back to having a more wholesome life, let's say.
Beautiful. So you're at a point whereby you're moving into a form of trial, is that right? So you're starting to think around what that process is going to look like.
Yeah, so I'm in the research design phase at the moment, and yeah, it's tricky because, yeah, I think there's a lot of options, and I really want to know what's going to have the most impact on the world. And there are quite a few dissertations that I'm discovering now that are unpublished. So a lot of things with sort of, theories and things, but not every dissertation gets published for various reasons. So at the moment, I'm sort of scouring through these unpublished dissertations that are out there to see if there's anything I can expand upon, if there's anything I can build upon. Because, as I said, I'm thinking of doing quantitative research, so more of like the scientific type thing rather than the qualitative research, which is more theoretical. But I could do something mixed methods, which would be maybe a study like a randomized controlled trial, and then using the information there to start to build a theoretical framework to say like, okay, it works. We know that it works from this randomized control trial, but still we really don't know how it works. As you mentioned, the default mode network, it could be a part of that, and it could be so many other things, but there is no one sort of like dominant theory at the moment. I think there's a lot of competing ones, and I guess it's less important how it works. I guess it's more important that it works. But I think for a lot of people, when they hear breath work, they're like, oh, what, you teach people how to breathe? I'm like, sort of. But it's so much more than that. And convincing people who may be skeptical to go into these sort of challenging environments, I think it will really help to have people to have really good research and a really good understanding of being like, this is what's going to happen and this is why it's good for you. And I think obviously we've got a mental health crisis all over the world, and I think there's sadly mental health treatments are not quite there yet. We need a lot of work. I mean, the fact that we have so many treatments like CBT and antidepressants and things, and the anxiety and depression rate really goes up. And I think a problem of the sort of self-development world is you either go down the mainstream world, you can speak to a doctor and they give you antidepressants, or you go off into the alternative world and maybe it's a little bit like new agey, it's quite flowery, and maybe you go to a town hall and you're dancing around, and I mean, that is how transformational breathwork started. I think Alan Dolan supposedly when he trained in transformational breathwork kind of simplified these things, took out the dancing, which is quite intimidating. Certainly for me, I hate dancing. It's absolutely terrifying, and making it a little bit more appealing to the masses. And I think that's what Headspace did. It sort of demystified it and been like, okay, yes, it's come from these traditions of Buddhism and Eastern spirituality, but it's actually really beneficial for the mainstream population. And that's kind of what I want to do, is like grab breath work, which has come from, Stan Grof, the 1960s, the kind of hippie movement, and be like, oh no, it's actually really useful for, the bankers and the doctors and the nurses in the mainstream. And I think that's going to be just good for everyone, good for society and good for people who are suffering.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've read a couple of books recently. One's called Crazy Like Us, and the other one I think is just called Sedators. But it really kind of set the scene of some of the key elements of, I guess, the mental health crisis, but also how some of these antidepressants and some of the conventional medicine treatments have become so widely used. People coming together to sculpt a narrative, to change a cultural narrative around antidepressants, for example, if that makes sense. So it was really quite jaw-dropping and shocking in regards to how that's all been managed over the last sort of decade or two. But I think what you're doing is so powerful, because we seem to be, I think, at a time when so many of us like to kind of intellectually understand why we should do something. So to be, as you say, to be able to actually have that knowledge and be like, look, this is the evidence, the research, some of the mechanisms that we're aware of. I think it engages another whole section of society, so to speak, who will do it if they have that kind of data there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think convincing people that they need help is the first step, and that 90 minutes of breathing with a group sometimes, it's hard to do. And yeah, what you were saying about antidepressants and the narrative, and there was a recent study that came out, I think it was an umbrella review, just showing how many antidepressant research studies were either like fraudulent or just showed less effect than a placebo, certainly less effect than exercise. It came out in the mainstream press. I posted it on my social media, and unfortunately, I think that is, it was about specifically about the chemical imbalance theory. Basically, so it showed that there had never been any evidence to suggest that depression, anxiety was caused by a chemical imbalance, and hence treating a chemical imbalance with antidepressants was never going to work. And I have been on antidepressants. They did not work for me. They probably made me worse, because once I kind of realized they weren't fixing me, I was just like, well, what do I do now? It was kind of no hope. And just like I said earlier about regression to the mean, I think a lot of people who do get benefit from antidepressants are just getting it better on their own, and then they're being robbed of their power to heal, because they're like, well, I didn't heal myself, these drugs healed me. And I'm just like, well, I reckon you probably did a lot of this, and actually you deserve the credit for your healing, not necessarily these pills. And that's really difficult for some people to hear. And I think it's certainly possible, and maybe even likely, that there are a small population who do get benefit from antidepressants, like legitimately their lives are made better by them. So they're not completely useless in my mind, but I think for some people they can really get in the way of healing. And I think it's Gitin Tonkov, the breath worker from BBTRS, one of his sayings is like, feeling better is about better feeling. You need to feel your emotions. You need to feel your sadness. You need to feel your grief, and trust that you can go through those processes so that you can come out the other side healthier, happier. And one of the things antidepressants do is numb you, and hence you can't actually feel those feelings as deeply as they need to be felt. And they're sort of a barrier to healing in some cases.
Yeah, I think, as you say, there's so many side effects from so many of these medicines that you're not really told about either. You've got to kind of go and do your own research. And I think from a microbiome perspective, with obviously Health Path being so focused on that, there was an interesting paper out, I think a couple of years ago, looking at how many, let's call it frequently prescribed medications actually have a disruptive impact on that microbiome that we just weren't aware of. So there are all of these problems that come with it. I think some antidepressants are also sort of hepatotoxic from memory as well. They're kind of not particularly good on the liver. So as you say, if there are other tools, that's such an important message to get out there. As well as what you were mentioning earlier, one thing I just want to quickly add is also not seeing some of these negative emotions as sort of negative per se, and actually, again, giving yourself permission to feel them, acknowledge them, and accept them. I think that can be such a challenging part of this. Like, as a society, we're told that there are bad, particularly negative emotions. There's certainly a bit of taboo around, like anger, for example, is not an emotion to express publicly, so to speak. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think befriending those negative emotions, and Rumi has that guest house poem of like, treat your emotions like a guest house, welcome them in, treat them well, and then they'll leave once they're done. Especially with anger and grief and sadness, they're all necessary parts of the human experience, and really necessary parts of just getting through to having that kind of baseline level of contentment. And I think another struggle that I have is, like, obviously we've just sort of poo-pooed the chemical imbalance theory of depression, and that one was obviously very popular because it was very convenient for everyone. It's like, the depressed person goes in and it's like, oh, don't worry, you don't have to change anything about your life, you just got a chemical imbalance. And then the doctor can be like, you know, rather than the doctor sitting with the feelings and being like, oh, we don't really have any good medications, I'm sorry, I can't give you anything like you know, like penicillin, which is phenomenally effective. I've just got these pills that maybe they work, maybe they don't. So the doctor doesn't have to deliver the bad news of like, maybe you're going to have to change your life. Maybe you're going to have to deal with difficult situations. Maybe you're going to have to do some different things, or even say like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't help you. So the doctor loves it. And then the family around them, especially if there's, you know, maybe abuse or things like that, family around them would be like, oh, great, well, we don't have to take responsibility for what we did to our child, to our brother, or things like that. And then society as well can come along and go, well, great, we don't have to change society. You know, we don't have to help people struggling. We don't have to encourage people to eat better or exercise. We can just give them a pill. And it's just like everyone sort of colluding on this lie, and the people that are suffering just continue to suffer without getting the support they really need. And there is no really like all-encompassing theory of depression. And I think for a lot of chronic illnesses, I think there's so many different causes of depression, anxiety. Obviously PTSD is quite clear, it's, you know, a particular event, but you know, depression can be caused by so many things. You know, it can be caused by childhood trauma. It can be caused by job stress. It can be caused by gut dysbiosis. It can be caused by a lack of sunlight, or a lack of exercise, or a poor diet, or just, you know, living with a parent with mental illness. There's just so many different causes and so many things that need to be addressed, and just addressing that with a pill is just like just not really enough. And that's why I think breathwork is phenomenal. But for some people, breathwork won't be it. For some people, what they need to do is quit their job and move to the countryside. For another people, it's they need to have a difficult conversation with their mother. For other people, it's, you know, they need to start walking in nature or getting a dog. Or there's so many treatment options that yeah, we need to promote.
Yeah, I think that's such a key point. I think it's in the book Crazy Like Us, where they have a similar message, which is around how, as a sort of cultural or societal narrative, the responsibility is placed on the individual, and there's an issue with the individual rather than an issue with the environment that they are in. So, you know, they have way too much responsibility at work, but what they're given is CBT, or a tool to make them more resilient, to be able to manage the burden that they're under, rather than actually saying, you know what, we've given you too much, you're doing two people's jobs because we had to let go of some people. Actually, we need to kind of manage the environment, the circumstance, not just place it on the individual having some sort of issue. And I thought that was such a great kind of concept, because we can be so blinded by that. You know, I think we are bombarded with this idea that we're an individual and it's on us, and we need to fix that solution on our own sometimes. Whereas you say, actually, there are so many other things that have to be considered here.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is that kind of that balance between, you know, if you want to heal from anxiety and depression, if it's like a nervous system related thing, you can approach it from both ends. Like, you can remove the amount of stress by, you know, hiring another employee in the scenario you just offered, or you can increase that person's resilience or tolerance of stress. And I think a lot of certainly the sort of the health optimization circles talk a lot about increasing resilience with things like ice baths and saunas and exercise. And they are really, really important, and everyone can benefit from more resilience and tolerance to stress. But there is also that sort of the darker side of increasing people's tolerance to stress. And the dark side to meditation is, like, you know, if there's a totalitarian government and they're abusing their population, but they're at the same time telling people, oh, don't worry, you know, just meditate your way through these uncomfortable feelings, then that, you know, you're enabling that abuse to continue. So where does the balance come? Like, is meditation problematic in a society where there is, you know, dictatorial and bad actions happening, but and does that rob someone of their motivation to go and, you know, campaign or revolt or make the changes and stop the abuse happening?
That's so interesting. Yeah, beautifully put. So I guess a question that comes up in regards to this is, how do you see this moving forwards? I guess for you, and maybe from an almost a breathwork space perspective. Do you have any kind of hopes or visions from that side of things?
Yeah, my hopes are that breathwork starts to be taken more seriously. It's kind of piggybacking on the psychedelic research that's happening. So much Netflix documentaries, Michael Pollan, Robin Carhart Harris, all these people doing these amazing research and getting incredible results with psychedelic assisted psychotherapies. And I think I don't think a lot of people get the same, and in some cases more, benefit from breath work than ayahuasca. When I was at Rhythmia in Costa Rica, there were people that said that, the best night was not the ayahuasca, it was the second breathwork session. So I'm hoping breathwork can really benefit from that research. And one of the problems of breathwork is there's just there's not much money in it, and hence no one's really putting money into research. Whereas I'm sure you've heard about compass pathways and things like that. With the psychedelic research, they're probably going to make a lot of money, but you can't really sell a pill of breath work. So it is going to require sort of passionate people and maybe some philanthropy to do the research and to keep promoting it. And my kind of goal is to see breathwork on the NHS, or out here in the US, paid for by insurance companies for people with anxiety and depression. And I mean, Joe Dispenza and his sort of visualization things, this is one of the ways, they talk about the power of manifestation. This is one of the examples of where for me in my personal life, where it's kind of taken a detour. Like I'd said a few years ago, right, I'm going to do this PhD and I'm going to get breath work on the NHS as an alternative to the other treatments. And as I mentioned, that company or that charity, Duty to Care, who offer free sessions to NHS staff, halfway through doing one of those sessions, I realized, oh my God, breathwork is on the NHS. I am giving breathwork to doctors on the NHS right here. And, this is kind of the power of manifestation for me. But it wasn't exactly how I imagined it. I imagined doctors prescribing breathwork to patients, but what actually has happened is I'm breathing the actual doctors themselves. So that was quite a funny example of manifestation that's actually worked in my life.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think that's beautiful, to both the fact that you had that objective, that vision for yourself and for the NHS ultimately, the fact that it's come through like it has as well. I guess, what's my question here? Have you sort of reflected, or if you have any experiences, I guess, from a breathwork psychedelic sort of perspective? So you mentioned some of the people you spoke to who the second breathwork session was actually more powerful than the ayahuasca ceremony. Do you have any sort of intentions to explore that more at all?
Do you mean like well, tell me what you mean.
As either maybe a form of preparation or integration, things like that.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, that was one of the ideas I got on an ayahuasca session, is like breath work can be in support of ayahuasca. And I just wrote a long piece about integration of psychedelics. It's a real buzzword in psychedelics, and I think it's being a little bit exploited. Integration coaches popping up on LinkedIn. I think you can do a lot of integration on your own. For some people, they need a coach to help them integrate something that was completely mind-blowing. For a lot of people, they can integrate just by going for a walk in nature with their dog, or just sitting silently, or journaling and things like that. And absolutely, I think breath work is an amazing tool for preparation and integration. As I said, at the start, there is a kind of hierarchy of intensity with these non-ordinary states of consciousness, and doing a breathwork session can be a really good way to prepare yourself for an ayahuasca or a psilocybin experience. And similarly, they say, like, your ayahuasca sessions, maybe you have 5, they can be unfolding for 6 months to a year after, and you've got to give them some space to unfold. And if you're just constantly snowed under from work and kids and all your other responsibilities, you never really have that chance to let your brain process, integrate. And breathwork, conscious connected breathwork, is a phenomenal way to get back into a similar mindset. And I think for a lot of people as well who are a little bit afraid of something like a mushroom or an ayahuasca experience, legitimately afraid, because it is incredibly intense. Breathwork is a really good alternative. It's something you can sort of switch off at any point. Once you're on ayahuasca, there's no turning back. There's no, please stop this ride, I'm getting off. Breathwork, you just close your mouth and go back to regular nasal breathing, and you're back to a state. You can do it on your lunch break and go back to work, although I don't recommend that because it can be really powerful. It is like a really accessible thing, and there's so much potential.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting what you say there around integration, because I 100% agree with you with what you said, and yet something I've said in the past is that I have concerns around psychedelics in really kind of the modern Western world, in the sense that my understanding from a slightly more indigenous perspective is integration is partly from the fact that this is done in community. Whereas we often, at this point in time, certainly in the UK, might be either obviously doing it underground, but let's just say jet setting up to the Netherlands or Portugal on our own, meeting some strangers for a couple of days, having a ceremony, coming back, and not necessarily having the community that I feel can be so helpful in regards to integration. Having said that, although I still think that, I also agree with you, showing that classic paradox of there is no sort of single truth here.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's what I'm sort of pushing back against is this idea of mandatory integration, because there is no word for it in a lot of these tribal settings. There is no word for integration. They don't need to highlight integration because it happens naturally. Because if you are in a community where ayahuasca has been around for a few hundred years, and you need to talk to someone about your first bad ayahuasca trip, you can go talk to your grandma and be like, how was your first trip? Whereas I can't talk to my grandma about that kind of thing, and I can't talk to many people about that thing. So having an understanding ear is definitely important. And coming back out, especially even if you just went into the jungle and didn't take ayahuasca, and you went there for 2 weeks and seeing that way of life, and then going back into London or a big city, that's really jarring in itself. So just integrating in that way is a challenge for a lot of people. And certainly there are people who there's two sides of like the integration. There's the harm reduction side, and the session maximization side. A lot of people, not a lot of people, but some people come out of ayahuasca and they are harmed. There's psychotic episodes, those types of things, and they need support. And they need the support of probably trained psychiatrists, doctors, psychotherapists. And my concern is that someone will just turn to a LinkedIn integration coach with no experience of dealing with mental health, and I have a lot of concerns about the coaching industry, how unregulated it is, and how I could just certify you, Alex, as a life coach right now under the Richard Blake Breath Geek certification process on a piece of toilet paper, and that would be as valuable as my life coaching certification that I did many years ago. And there is no oversight. If a coach does something wrong, that they don't lose their license and things. And I think it's particularly important to do something about the harm reduction side of psychedelic integration, because it is such a fragile time post ayahuasca, post mushrooms. And it's I could go on and on about the life coaching industry, but I'll pause there.
No, but it is a concern. I think it's the same with I have increasing concerns with the supplement industry ultimately, because you read more and more around some of the studies that have been done, but also like what policies apparently are in place and how poor those policies are. So apparently there is a general policy for supplement manufacturing or production, which means you have to be within a certain percentage of what you say from a nutrient content perspective. So if it's 100 milligrams of vitamin C that you're saying on the label, well, it could be 50 and it could be up to 130. And like, there's not even specificity apparently around that. And then, as you probably know, studies showing us that there are bacteria and probiotics that are in the product that aren't on the label, or bacteria that are on the label that aren't in the product. So yeah, it's concerning, but take that to what you're discussing, which is kind of someone's mental health and well-being post a particularly challenging experience, and that's a whole nother level ultimately.
Yeah, I think this is a problem of the whole wellness industry. You know, it has just boomed in the last 10, 20 years. You know, the supplement industry, the life coaching industry, all these things are just accelerated so quickly that regulation hasn't been able to keep up. Whereas psychotherapy has been around for nearly 100 years now, since, if you say Freud was the start of it, and they've had a lot of time to create things like the UKCP and create these, yeah, very well regulated industries. But at the same time, I think they may have also done too much. You know, my wife is studying to be a psychotherapist over here in California, and as well as doing a master's, she also has to do personal therapy of 40 hours a year and 3,000 hours of clinical placements, 3,000 hours before she's registered. And if you are, you know, a 28-year-old having a life transition, you know, you're working in marketing, and then you think, oh, actually, I want to get into helping people. You think, oh, yeah, maybe I'll become a psychotherapist or a life coach. And you think, well, I could do a master's that takes 4 years part-time and 3,000 hours, or I could do this weekend course in life coaching. I think I'll do the weekend course in life coaching, please. And I just won't work with anyone who has trauma, or I won't work with anyone who has mental health issues. And my response to that is, I've never heard a life coach refer someone out for having mental health issues. There's an integrity issue there. It's because, you know, life coaches probably often are overconfident and think they can handle anything, and probably need the money, especially if they're starting out. And the other thing is, if you've never had any training in what a mental health issue is, how in your weekend course are you going to learn, okay, that's PTSD, that's depression, I need to refer someone out there? And another thing is, yeah, my wife's training in California. Her licensure is only valid in California. She can't even take it to Texas and be a psychotherapist there. Whereas you can be an online life coach in London and work with people in California, Texas, Bali, Australia, and charge about 5 times as much. So yeah, this is the kind of the dilemma of how to regulate mental health spaces.
Yeah, that's a really great example of the polarity of this, I guess, ultimately. Richard, is there anything that you would like to finish with? Anything that you feel we haven't yet covered in regards to your journey and your vision?
Yeah, I think that there's nothing we haven't really covered, but yeah, just to reiterate, I think breathwork is it's a real gift. You know, it's a real gift from, I don't know who, someone is giving us this free training, this free experience, and I think there's a lot to come with the breathwork industry. There's some growing pains. You know, regulation needs to be sorted out. Yeah, because certainly with breathwork, you know, just maybe a life coach could do a lot less harm than a breath worker. A breath worker, you know, you're doing breath holds, you're doing things in the water. You know, a lot of breath workers work with ice and cold therapy. There was someone who died recently, and I think in Manchester, in a cold exposure environment and breath work. And I think there's a lot of questions to be answered around what's a safe practice, who should be doing breath work, who shouldn't be doing breath work, who should be teaching it, who shouldn't be teaching it. And yeah, I am starting to work with something called the Global Breathwork Practitioners Alliance, which is a kind of governing body for teacher training schools. And they've been around for about 20 years, but now with the explosion of breathwork, they're starting to get more active of, you know, starting to regulate people and hopefully having some more oversight and weeding out bad actors and kind of keeping consumers safe and keeping practitioners safe, because, you know, as a personal breath worker, I don't want to see another breath worker doing shady practices and giving the industry a bad name. So I'm hoping that some kind of regulatory body can really come in and save the day, you know.
Yeah, no, it's a really great point. What was the organization that you just mentioned?
Yeah, the GBPA, the Global Breathwork Practitioners Alliance, and Jim Morningstar is the head of that. And they've got a lot of the big names like Clarity Breathworker involved there, Judith Kravitz from Transformational Breathwork, Richie Bostock, the breath guy is involved. And yeah, we're starting to look at sort of modernizing it a little bit.
Brilliant. I'll have to check that out. And where can people, you know, learn a little bit more about you, find you? And I don't think you're offering kind of one-to-one breath work with doing your PhD at this point in time, but are there any kind of directions that you could point people in if they're kind of resonating with what you're saying and would like to explore this more?
Yes, I'm on Instagram. I'm at the Breath Geek, and that's the_breath_geek. I also publish my PhD papers on Medium and on my website. You can find that at thebreathgeek.com. And yeah, those are quite sort of in-depth articles on things like, well, I just done one on ayahuasca integration. I've just done one on visualization and manifestation, and sort of looking through the studies at a, you know, more of a scientific way. And yeah, that's where I have yeah, I was just thinking about my most popular article on there is about ayahuasca and narcissism. That seems to be have just exploded for some reason. A lot of people are interested in ayahuasca as a treatment for narcissism. So that might be one your audience likes to check out. And yeah, you can find it on my website in the blog section.
Brilliant. Richard, thank you so much. It's been brilliant to catch up with you and hear what you're up to and the things that you are doing. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure, Alex. Great to speak to you again.